First Corinthians chapter 11. If you got a Bible, First Corinthians chapter 11. Finish the statement for me. Easy come, easy come, easy go. How about a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush? No shirt, no shoes, no Kenny Chesney fans? Well, you know those. Well, you know those because of where you live. If someone were in the audience today from, the other side of the planet, or from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, they would have probably no clue how to answer any of those statements. You know the answer to them and how to answer it because of who you are and where you lived, and you are a product of this culture, which has its own sayings and thoughts and beliefs. Well, ancient Corinth was no different, and so we come to a place in 1 Corinthians where Paul is going to hit on some cultural ideals that sound a little bit foreign to us. When you look at this ancient statue depicting a lady from about 2,000 years ago, you may pick up on several things that would be different from our culture. For instance, the way that she has dressed on her body is a little bit different. She wears her hair, something around her head, that is a little bit different, and she has something draped over her head that's a little bit different. If you saw her walking down Main Street this morning, you may think, well, that's odd. Wonder why she's dressed that way. If you saw her walking down the street in ancient Corinth, you would think, oh, well, there's Susan. Nice to see you, Susan. Wouldn't matter to you because that's how people dressed then. It was common to them, not common to us. And so sometimes when we read things in ancient letters like 2,000 years ago, the letter to the Corinthians, and especially when we read ancient letters that were written to a totally different population on the other side of the planet with more of an Eastern thought concept set against our Western thoughts, a lot of the things you read in Scripture seem a bit strange sometimes. And even if they don't seem a little bit strange to us because we've heard it from time to time, some of the things we see in Scripture, we wonder, how does that make any sense? What in the world is Paul trying to get across to these folks? And if I'm honest with you, what he does in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is in that ballpark for me. You're going to read some words about head coverings. You're going to read about, praying and prophesying with heads covered and uncovered. And I got to tell you on the front end that these are Eastern thoughts from an Eastern religion. Christianity originated in the East, migrated to the West. We read it with Western eyes. They had different concepts than we have today. And Western people, if I'm honest with you, we're going to have a harder time with some of the concepts that we talk about this morning. The veil, the covering that you see on this stone statue was a very important part of wardrobe in ancient Corinth. Very important part of their wardrobe, especially for married women. And there are a lot of cultural concepts that underlie that we can talk about. But I just want you to know that on the front end. I also want you to know on the front end that this section that we're going to talk about begins in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2, which happens to come right after 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. And 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1 is what we talked about last week. Imitate me, Paul says, as I imitate Christ. We said that's the crux of the matter. Well, what Paul does is he takes the crux of the matter and he comes up for air and he says it, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Let's imitate Jesus, imitate God as we find him on the cross, be conformed to the image of God, partakers of the divine nature. That's how the Bible writers describe it. And then they spend a lot of time talking to us about what that may look like in each particular circumstance. And so Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, imitate Christ. And then in verse 2, he says, here's what that may look like in your context. And he's going to talk about the clothes that they wore to church. And he's going to talk about how they partook of the Lord's Supper when they gather around the table together. He's going to talk about all kinds of different concepts pertaining to what a worship service looked like. And it was all supposed to be centered on the idea that we are imitating Christ in every area of our lives, whether it's what we wear, how we partake of the Lord's Supper, what we do at church, how we love one another. It all is centered on Jesus. Well, in chapter 11, Paul starts talking about a lady's hair in ancient Corinth. For in that time, a lady to appear in public without her hair covered. Now, this is totally foreign to us. I get it, but it's what they're dealing with. It's one of those things they knew in their time. It's kind of lost in ours. To appear in public with hair uncovered was to invite looks. It was to invite other people to look at you and to check you out. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, her hair was her glory. It was a major attraction for the opposite sex in the first century. It was even an object of lust in the ancient world in Corinth. And so Paul is giving them instructions about how to be more like Jesus in 1 Corinthians 11. And he says, look, part of that means that you will not dress in a way, wear your hair in a way, show up in a way that brings glory to you if you're seeking to glorify God. That fundamental thought is under everything he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This is Paul's instruction to them about how to remove distractions when they show up to worship God, to glorify God as the church body. So here's what he says, and we'll just read some of it. Verse 2, I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is the husband, the head of Christ is God. And every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife or woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if she will not cover her head, she should cut her hair short. But since it's disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. Man not ought to cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God. Woman is the glory of man. Man was not made for woman, but woman for man. And then he goes on and on. But the part that we need to deal with is in the first part of 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Well, if you're like me and you read that and you think, what in the world did Paul just say? What is it about the head? What is it about the hair? What is it about shaving the head? But that's disgraceful, and so put a covering on the head. Well, there's a lot that goes into that. Paul's interests are about reforming social assumptions and conventions of the day in the Christian community. And so what Paul is doing is taking what the Corinthians would have known as honoring and what they'd have known as disgraceful, and he's applying it to what they do when they gather together as a church family. Christians, he says, basically are supposed to have a unique identity different from the world around them. Christians are still supposed to have a unique identity that's different from the world around us. And so Paul instructs them to adopt new Christian customs, an identity that would stand out to the world around them. And what Paul would tell us, the principle underlying whatever he says in 1 Corinthians 11, is that you should adopt new Christian customs and behaviors that will stand out against the world around you. I want you to note that in this discussion of distractions, Paul addresses both men and women. And because Paul does, we will too. What I hope to show you this morning is that without even thinking about it, unintentionally, without even thinking about it, we could be pushing back against what Paul is teaching here without even knowing it. This is a text about removing distractions, about presenting ourselves in such a way when we come together to worship God that the focus can be on worshiping God and building one another up. And the focus is not on ourselves. So this has been a problem from the very beginning. If you got a Bible, back in Genesis chapter 2, I don't want to jump right into 1 Corinthians 11, which is a text that is a bit vague in our Western eyes. There are a couple of more we're going to visit that are very clear, or clearer. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and 1 Peter chapter 3. We'll get to those in a little bit. But I don't want to jump right into what Paul tells the Christians without figuring out what God has been saying about this thing all along. And so it all begins back in Genesis chapter 2 when God has created the world and the people are there, and they don't have any clothes on. We'd look at them today, and we'd say, that's pretty immodest of you. Why are you doing that? But it was perfectly fine for them. As Byron read for us just a minute ago, Genesis chapter 2, 24 and 25, they were naked and had no shame. That kind of thing doesn't happen in today's world. Not in this part of today's world anyway. So what in the world happened? Why could they, in Genesis chapter 2, be fully unclothed, not even a discussion of modesty, and be okay with it, naked and not ashamed? Why is that there? Well, I think verse 24 sets the scene for verse 25. What you find in Genesis 2:24 is that they are together. There's no disunity, there's no sin, there's no disharmony, there's complete commitment between a man and a woman. There's peace, there's unity, there's cooperation. They're in the garden together. The two had become one flesh. It was very good. And so they look at each other, naked and all, and have no shame. You flip the page and go to Genesis chapter 3, and that changes. In the early part of Genesis chapter 3, serpent is in the garden, and he shows up, and did God really say that you cannot eat of the fruit of the tree of knowing good and evil? He said, Eve says, he said, don't even touch the fruit. Not just don't eat it, don't even touch the fruit. Well, God didn't mean what he said. What he meant, and what he was guarding against, the serpent says, is that you would be like him. And he didn't want you to be like him, knowing good and evil. So he said, don't eat the fruit. So you can eat fruit if you want to. You shall not surely die. And so they eat the fruit. And you know what happens immediately after they eat the fruit in Genesis chapter 6? Their eyes are opened. And they notice, we don't have any clothes on. The only thing that changed, it's not their wardrobe. Nothing changed with their wardrobe. The only thing that changed, sin has crept in. Their eyes are open. And now there's shame, and there's guilt, and there's blame. And this whole harmony that we had just a chapter before in Genesis 2:25 is reversed. Peace is gone, the unity is gone, the commitment seems to be gone. They're blaming each other, and things have just really gone downhill. And so because of their shame, they cover themselves up. Little fig leaves to cover themselves. Didn't really work very well, apparently, because by the time you get to Genesis 3:21, God makes them some coverings. What was the problem? They were not immediately uglier. Their form didn't immediately change. What happened is that the relationship between male and female, like the other relationships in creation, were broken. Eyes are open. We realize now something's wrong. We see now that something is wrong. So we've got to do something to cover up what we have done. Male-female relationship is broken. The rest of history, in part, is about repairing what has been broken. From that time forward, the relationships between men and women have been damaged by lust and by jealousy, and by adultery, and by pornography, and by a lot of things that destroy these relationships. This is why in Genesis 39, Joseph has really, really big problems with Potiphar's wife. This is also why Samson could not resist the advances of Delilah, gives in to her questions. This is why David falls to Bathsheba and why his family has to deal with all the consequences and repercussions of that sin. This is why Solomon has over 1,000 sexual partners thousands of years ago, and it's why his foreign wives eventually lead to his downfall and that of the kingdom. It all goes back to Genesis 3. It always does. Today, what we're talking about is not really David or Solomon or Samson or Joseph or Adam and Eve. We're talking about this today is the reason why people struggle with lust and people struggle with needing love, why spouses struggle with faithfulness. It's why pornography is a billion-dollar business. It's why sexuality, modesty, immodesty is a dangerous thing. It's why Paul talks about covering your hair, which is your glory, in 1 Corinthians 11. And it's why we're talking about it today. Because it could tempt a person to struggle with sinful sexual desires and thoughts. Because even if it doesn't, the way we present ourselves can tempt others to covet our looks or to covet the attention that we get because of how we present ourselves. And ultimately, and this is my focus, and this is Paul's focus in 1 Corinthians 11, ultimately because it can distract other people from seeing Jesus in you. It can bring glory to myself or to yourself and take the focus away from God. And that is why it's a dangerous thing. From the very beginning, female relationships have been a struggle. There's always been a need to discuss sexuality seriously. And for the remainder of our time today, I believe we will do just that. So, 1 Timothy chapter 2. Let's talk a little bit about this word modesty. Now, when we use the word modesty, you probably have in mind what I'm about to say. You probably think, well, we're going to talk about the amount of skin shown. And we are. We're going to talk about the tightness of the fit, how low cut it is, what it reveals, what it hides. And yes, those things are in focus in what Paul talks about in his letters. But I don't think we have to go bit by bit by bit to understand what Paul's discussing. That is how modesty shows up. But if you read the commentaries and you read the definition of the words that Paul uses, they are words that discuss a heart issue. And that heart issue influences how we present ourselves to the world. It's that way in everything. Jesus talked about speech, and he said it's not a speech issue. It's not just the words that come out of your mouth. It's the overflow of your heart. And he also uses that to talk about a lot of our behaviors. It's not just a behavior problem. It's not just a dress problem. It's not just a lust problem. It's not just a this or that problem. It is a problem with the heart. And the word that Paul uses for modesty is a heart word. It's an issue that starts in the heart and in the motives. It really diagnoses what we want the world to see about ourselves. That's the word that Paul uses. It's deeper than just what we present. It's why we present what we will present. So that's the word modesty. I will from now on use it how we typically think of it as it pertains solely to how we show ourselves by what we dress and what we wear, because that's what Paul hits on. It's a hard issue. It shows up in the closet. So here's what it is. 1 Timothy chapter 2. This is probably the classic text on this when it gets down to verse 9 and 10. So 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. Likewise, that the women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty. There's the word. And he links it to self-control. So if you talk about the three words that Paul uses to describe this, it's respectable, modesty, self-control. Then he gives some, again, very century world cultural details, not with braided hair, gold, pearls, or costly attire. What's interesting about that is that those are usually the things that people wear to church today. And Paul says, I'm telling you not to do that. Now, why would Paul say, look, let's be respectable and modest with some self-control? And the way that he says we need to look at that is how we wear the hair, and do we wear the gold and the pearls and the costly clothes? Because in that context, the gold and the pearls and the costly clothes, and as we've already seen from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the hair draws attention to the person. So Paul is saying in 1 Timothy chapter 2, don't do that stuff, because all you're doing is drawing attention to yourself. Modest, respectable, well-ordered arrangement that's in harmony on the outside with who you are on the inside. governing yourself, getting a hold of your desires to be seen by others. That's what Paul says. That's the word that he uses for modest. And for him, it shows up in gold, pearls, costly attire, and how you wear your hair. Draws attention to yourself and takes it away from where it should be on Christ. All right, that's 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter has more words along these lines. Let's skip down to verse 3, where, verse 3. Do not let your adorning be external. He hits on some very similar cultural aspects. The braiding of hair, the putting on of gold, jewelry, or the clothing that you're going to wear. Why? Same answer. Because he says what you're adorning, your attractiveness, what draws people to you, that's the word, is not about clothes, should not be about clothes or hair or the jewelry that you wear. The kind of attractiveness that God desires, verse 4, should be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Do you see how Peter takes it from the outside? He says, let's talk about what's underneath it. It comes from the heart. A gentle spirit that trusts in God above everything else. A great definition of modesty is humility expressed in behaviors, and specifically for Peter and Paul, humility expressed in our clothing. It's about serving God by glorifying Him, and it's about serving others by not wanting to generate impure, lustful thoughts in their mind. And so if you're wondering on the front end, how does imitate Jesus turn into Paul's discussion of how we present ourselves, clothing and hair coverings in 1 Corinthians 11, well, I hope that's the answer. That this is the way to serve God and to serve others by being concerned about what is going on in their mind. Immodesty is the opposite. It's arrogantly drawing undue attention to yourself. That's probably the best definition. Arrogantly drawing undue attention to yourself, which means I don't care what kind of thoughts I may generate in the mind of somebody else. You know, James talks about this a little bit from a different perspective in a passage that's not typically included in the modesty talks. James chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, he's talking about people who show up to church services dressed in ways that get them all kind of attention. He's talking about men. So if you got a Bible, let's flip back a few pages and see what James says about it. James chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Brothers, he says, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, if you pay attention, there's the key. You pay attention to the one that wears the fine clothing and say, you sit in that good place. And you say to the poor man, well, you can go, who cares? Go sit there. Sit out of my feet. You don't matter. That's wrong. It's the same concept. Someone shows up, dressed in a way, presenting themselves in a way, wearing the jewelry in a way that garners them attention and creates wrong thoughts, lustful or not, in the other worshipers. James says that is wrong. You have made a distinction, he said, among yourselves. You've become the judges with evil thoughts. Do you see how these concepts are all linked together? What we wear leads to what people think, which leads to thoughts and maybe desires that shouldn't be there. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus offers some words about this. Matthew chapter 5 is part of the Sermon on the Mount. And it, in my opinion, would be an injustice to present one side of the issue and not spend at least a few minutes on the other side. This is a lust issue. It becomes a lust issue. And Jesus says in verse 27, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Well, it doesn't pull any punches, does he? You've heard the commandment. It's number 7. You probably memorized it. Do not commit adultery. Check. But then he takes it deeper. And he says, everybody who looks upon a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That law, pre-Jesus, would have been pretty easy to keep, plain, shunned by the religious society. But the original intent was different. And what Jesus seems to say is that it's likely that many who had been keeping the letter of the law had missed the mark of the intent. So the words of Jesus here should lead us to dig a little bit deeper. Should cause us to investigate our lives, our hearts. When we're forced to look inwardly at our hearts, we've got to admit our guilt. That lust makes us guilty. Lustful intent makes us guilty. And Jesus doesn't give me the ability to blame somebody else for my lustful intent. He doesn't give you the ability to blame anybody else for your lustful intent. Let's not outsource the sin. Here's what Jesus says about it. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better that you lose one of your members than the whole body thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Throw it away. Pretty steep. Don't outsource the sin. Don't look for somebody else to blame. Don't put the blame on the TV or the computer or the woman. Could have been you. And so what do we do about it? Well, now we're back to 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1. Imitate me as I imitate Christ, Paul says. And he tells the church there, that should influence how you dress. And I'm going to leave you with the same question I left you with last week. This is not an accident. I meant to leave the slide there. Who do you imitate? Who are you trying to imitate? With your behaviors, thoughts, and as Paul invites us to discuss, even with how you dress. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. I love God. I want to remove distractions from people trying to come to God. I imitate others who get the attention that maybe I want. Claim that I think I deserve. The looks that I think I'd appreciate. How do you fix the problem? Well, the problem is immodesty. And I think it's a daily decision to deny yourself and take up your cross every day and choose to be separate from the world. Now, that will have huge implications for all of life. The way we dress is one of them. It's not the only one. And so if my problem is immodesty, it's choose to be separate from the world. If my problem is lust, then it's a daily decision to deny myself and take up my cross daily and think about what thoughts and images and ideas and words and TV shows and songs and movies and books and websites do I allow to influence my heart and to shape my perspective. I got to tell you, when it comes to serious sin, there must be serious action to remove it from our lives. Don't pamper it. Don't flirt with it. Don't entertain it for a while. Enjoy it a little. Hate it. Crush it. In the words of Jesus, pluck it out and cut it off. It's causing you to sin. Because it's your hand. It's your eye. Your dress. Your lust. Your phone. Your wardrobe. your eyes. Imitate me as I imitate Christ, Paul says. A convenient time for us to consider, who are we imitating in our lives? This morning, there may be things you want to get right. There may be thoughts, attitudes, behaviors in your life that have taken you closer to imitating others and farther from imitating Jesus. Paul would invite us, I would invite us to come back. There may be folks who are looking to get started in imitating Jesus in their lives right now. Maybe that means that today you begin this journey of seeking to imitate Christ in all that you say and do and live, think, and act. Today, there may be other things on your mind that we haven't even touched on, but it's on your mind, and you know it, and you want to make it right. And so today, if you're ready to begin this journey with Christ, being baptized and having your sins washed away, put off the old so you can put on the new, let's do that. Maybe there are things going on that have taken you away from Jesus. Let's get right back on the right track. Maybe there are things we can be praying about for you and for your family. And so today, if you have any need, we invite you to make that need known while together we stand and sing this song to invite you.